Who were the first Americans? Where did they come from? To answer that question, I imagine many people would just quickly think of the Europeans who came here and created colonies and eventually founded various nation states. And that's a valid point to make about the growth of American civilizations. But weren't there already people living here? Before the Europeans, I mean. And that's who we mean when we say the first Americans, the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Consequently, when the European explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries arrived here in the so-called New World, they didn't find an empty land, did they? There were millions of people already living here. It's impossible to say exactly how many people, but archaeological evidence, along with some creative number crunching and first-hand accounts from Europeans who met Indians at the time, suggests that the population of North and South America taken together was probably between 50 and 100 million people, with some researchers settling on a number of around 72 million. So that was the native population of the Americas, the first peoples, people we often refer to today as either Indian or Native American. Yet, even the use of the term native or indigenous can be challenged. World history, the major events we study, and the growth of civilizations is often dominated by human migrations, by relatively large groups of people moving from place to place, sometimes staying in the new location, often disrupting completely the lives and cultures that were there before them. So it's probably fair to ask, where do Native Americans come from? The answer to that is tricky. You see, most Indians would argue that yes, indeed, they are from here, from America. The Osage natives of the United States, for example, whose lands were to be found around the US state of Kentucky, do not believe they crossed into the Americas from anywhere else. Rather, they say they are descended from two brothers, the sons of Father Sun and Mother Moon. Now, this was during the time of the ancient ones who lived in the land between earth and heaven. But back then, the earth was covered with water. The brothers were told by their mother, the moon, to live among the animals of the earth. So they descended unto the earth and convinced the elk to help them by drinking enough water to expose the land beneath the water. And so it was that the brothers and their descendants were able to dwell upon the earth, the first people. The Zuni of New Mexico also tell of an origin involving two brothers. They say that the world was created by the chief of all the gods, the god of the sun, Awona Willona. But the people had been left deep in the womb of the earth, trapped in darkness, until Awona Willona took pity on them and sent his two sons down into the earth to bring the people up into the light. After a difficult journey, they managed to do so, leading the Zuni to the sacred mountain, Doa Yalani, Corn Mountain. But what does scientific research tell us? Research in archaeology, paleoanthropology, even genetics. While the spiritual beliefs of many Native Americans would disagree with this, scientific research has indicated that even the Native Americans were not truly indigenous to the Americas. The history of humankind in the so-called New World seems to have begun some 20,000 years ago, when nomadic hunters from Siberia migrated across a land bridge connecting northeastern Asia with what would come to be called Alaska. This migration may have occurred in a series of waves, the first wave of immigrants arriving in the Americas around 20,000 years ago, while the last wave came some 12 to 14,000 years ago, shortly after which, with the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose and the land bridge was covered with water. Now, these first Americans from Asia knew nothing initially about the land they found themselves inhabiting, nothing about the nature or size of the Americas. Nonetheless, from the time of the first migration on, their numbers grew as they spread out, journeying from Alaska all the way down to the tip of South America. What first drove them on this great quest was most likely food, the crucial need to find reliable hunting grounds or streams to fish. The discovery of herding grounds, say of buffalo, probably exceeded any access they had previously had to dependable sources of food, and this allowed for greater populations to flourish. So too did developments in hunting technology, including the use of flaked hard stone spear points, which allowed early humans to kill larger game at greater distances. However, the most essential encouragement to population growth came with the advent of agriculture. The largest civilizations of the Americas in 1492 were all agricultural societies. As the glaciers of the Pleistocene age receded, they left behind a land with an increasingly warm climate and consequently lusher vegetation. Cultivation was the fundamental cause for the great expansion of cities and the growth of civilizations. Cultivation brings about a major transformation in culture. From nomadic hunters and gatherers, the first Americans adapted to a sedentary life. They built more permanent homes where they could live year-round while they took care of their crops and the animals they domesticated. Their attitudes began to change. Ideas about government, society, and the gods. This agricultural revolution didn't happen overnight in any part of the world. In the Americas, it occurred gradually during the Archaic era from around 8000 to 500 BCE. When Europeans arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries, looking for a passage to the east, to Asia, and access to the rich trade to be found there, they encountered peoples apparently very different from themselves, but nonetheless with many similarities. For example, the powerful Aztec Empire situated in Mexico had flourished into a very large and rather prosperous civilization. In 1519, when Hernán Cortés sailed from Cuba to Mexico and encountered the Aztecs, whom the Spanish would quickly dominate, he found a population of some 5 to 6 million people. The Aztec were living then not in small villages and straw huts or tents as the natives of the Americas have been often portrayed in movies, but in large urban areas surrounded by vast agricultural zones, much like one might have seen in Europe at the time. Likewise, the Maya of Mexico and Central America were an advanced indigenous people. The Maya numbered some 5 to 10 million people living in city-states ruled by kings who ordered their people to build vast pyramid-shaped temple complexes. And unlike their neighbors, the Maya had actually invented a complete hieroglyphic writing system. Clearly, when Europeans arrived in the Americas, they did not discover a new world at all, but a world that had been inhabited for around 15,000 years by a great variety of people.